All right, if I can get your attention, let's go ahead and come back together. We want to get started so we have enough, give Dr. Calhoun plenty of time to speak to us, and so we can get to this little thing in the cafeteria I know you're all thinking about at this point in time called lunch. It is a pleasure to welcome to this platform a friend of this seminary, a brilliant guy, and just a very creative philosopher, apologist, Dr. David Calhoun from Gonzaga University, who's taught me extensively about ways that we could use film and apologetics and a number of other subjects that I think he's quite gifted in studying and researching. Please welcome to the platform Dr. David Calhoun.
Hello. I'm afraid that I should start by saying my talk goes in the category "and now for something completely different." If you know your Monty Python, it really what I want to do is offer a talk that's got two main parts. One is I'm going to talk a little bit theoretically about film and why we should think that films make arguments, which means we who care about culture should learn how to read films, read the arguments that films offer. And secondly, I'm going to offer a fairly brief presentation of a filmmaker that many of you probably haven't even heard of, a guy named Terrence Malick. So let's proceed. A central problem in contemporary film is the question of whether films can make arguments, and if they do, how they make arguments. Now, we need to be clear about genres here. Pretty much everyone agrees that documentary films make arguments, right? Documentary films proceed by the filmmaker arranges images and interviews often in order to make a case. The problem really about argumentation in film has to do with narrative fiction films, which, of course, most popular films are narrative fiction films. And you can see the nature of the problem if you just think about, we're all apologists here, so you know what arguments are. Arguments have a certain kind of structure where you offer evidence and then a conclusion follows from the evidence. If you think about a fictional narrative is a sequence of concrete events that involve characters and plot and situation and so forth. And you can see, it seems pretty obvious that nothing follows from a narrative in the way that a conclusion follows from evidence. So if we think about the nature of the genre, we can see that there's a puzzle here about how to think about films making arguments. So one model, if we're thinking in this sort of initial way of characterizing things, we might have a fairly straightforward continuum where argumentative films consist, this is really tiny print, but if you can read that, on the left side, we have a continuum. On the left side, argumentative films would be documentaries. On the far right side, non-argumentative films, and that would be fictional narrative films like the Star Wars film that's currently out in theaters. Now, we might complicate this a little bit. Again, it's tiny print, but we might complicate it a little bit by saying, well, there are message films, so-called message films. That is, films that we realize as advancing a certain view. And I thought of the film October Baby would be an example, right, where we think of that as a message film. It tells the story of a person, but it's a person who was a survivor of a botched abortion, and her attempt to find out about her own past, which in a way the story communicates a message of the value of human life and of forgiveness ultimately. And similarly, we might say that we understand that maybe fable films would serve as kind of falling on this continuum as well. That is, films that have a clear moral. You remember Aesop's fables, right? There's a story, and we know at the end of the story we can summarize it with a message like be patient, or don't trust people who have ulterior motives, or something like that. An example I thought of a recent film that is something like a fable film is the Pain film about Schmidt, where at the end, actually, the main character, played by Jack Nicholson, he actually draws the conclusion of the fable, or offers us the moral of the fable, which basically is that to focus one's life on trivialities is to waste it. So if we think about this, we've got a fairly simple typology then of argumentation in film, where only a few special kinds of narrative fiction films would count as argumentative, whereas the vast majority of them would not. However, I would argue this minimalist account seems too simplistic, because narrative films can argue by richly representing the world, representing a way of looking at the world, a stance toward the world, an interpretive stance. We might call it a worldview. And typically it does that by showing the plausibility of a certain way of looking at the world in the structure of the plot, and the interaction of the characters, and the interaction of the characters with the world. Now, I think we have some, I'm not a literary theorist, I'm a philosopher, but I think we have some good literary theory references to make sense of how this would work. You probably are familiar with Coleridge's famous statement that the success of imaginative literature, what he calls poetic faith, depends on the willing suspension of disbelief. But I want to counter Coleridge's comment with a quote from Tolkien. Tolkien argues that literary belief produced by successful fiction requires that the storymaker so enchant the reader that the reader willingly enters into and inhabits a fictional secondary world that the reader finds believable. He's talking here about fantasy literature, but I think we can extend the idea to fictional narratives in all forms. As Tolkien says, and this is from his essay on fairy stories, he says, inside the secondary world, what the author relates is true. It accords with the laws of that world. You therefore believe it while you are, as it were, inside. The moment disbelief arises, the spell is broken, the magic, or rather art, has failed. You are then out in the primary world again, looking at the little abortive secondary world from outside. So you can see what he means, that a successful fictional narrative engages us and draws us into that world. You can think of this in a very concrete way, right? If you're flipping the pages of Lord of the Rings and you don't notice the passage of time, that's exactly what Tolkien's talking about. If you're reading, I don't know, maybe Lord of the Rings or something else, and you find yourself yawning and looking at your watch, then that the success of the art, the enchantment, is broken. So successful fiction so fully draws the reader in that no self-deception, to go back to Coleridge's comment, right, no willing suspension of disbelief is necessary. If readers really like the story, quote, for itself, they would not have to suspend disbelief, they would believe. Interesting here, I mean, you can think about how this connects with this whole question about belief and enchantment, connects with other things that we're interested in as apologists. So if this is the case, successful fiction doesn't depend on, as we said, willing suspension of disbelief, but something like the plausible construction of imaginative experience. The storymaker so arranges the elements of the narrative in such a way that the story becomes a live experiential possibility. Of course, albeit one that is different from the world as we in fact experience it. Thus, fictional narrative is the imaginative exploration of the counterfactual. The world as it could be, or perhaps as it is for some people, but not for the reader. So if a work of fiction goes beyond merely depicting a possible imaginative world and advocates for it, perhaps by drawing out positive implications of viewing the world in that particular way, or suggesting negative implications of rejecting that way of looking at the world. And you can do this, of course, an author of a fictional work can do this by the way the character engages the world and the way the events in the fictional narrative are constructed. Then I would argue it's engaged in a kind of argumentation. So if you remember the continuum I had where we have mostly documentary on the argumentative side, and then almost all works of fiction except for these strange cases of message films and fable films would all be non-argumentative. What I really want to argue is that almost all fictional narratives make an argument of some kind or other. In other words, they present a certain way of engaging the world through the characters, through the way the characters are involved in the narrative. And insofar as, to go back to Tolkien's way of putting this, insofar as the narrative succeeds in drawing us in, and we at least find their way of engaging the world plausible, we find it, to use William James's phrase from The Will to Believe, we find it a live option, then the fiction has succeeded. This particularly can happen if the fictional narrative plays competing ways of looking at the world against one another, sometimes in the form of a character who is torn between different ways of looking at things, and sometimes between different characters. We see a struggle between, should we understand the world one way or understand the world another way? I would say a classic example of this is M. Night Shyamalan's film Signs from 2002, in which Graham Hess, played by Mel Gibson, is a former pastor who has lost his faith and given up his pastoral career due to a terrible freakish tragedy. His wife is pinned to a tree in an auto accident while she's out on a walk, and she has a limited time that she's able to communicate with Graham Hess, but then she dies. And as a result of that, Graham Hess gives up his pastorate. He abandons his faith. He's angry with God. It's hard to say, at different points in the film, it's hard to say, does he not believe in God anymore, or is he angry with God because he thinks God is a cruel monster? It's hard to say, but it's one or the other. In a pivotal scene, if you know the film, it's the scene where he and his brother, played by Joaquin Phoenix, are sitting on the couch after they've been watching the news, which seems to be reporting the first steps of an alien invasion. He suggests that there are two kinds of people in the world: those who think that someone is watching out for them, that is, those who see the world through the eyes of a providential filter, those who see the world as providentially governed and engaged by God, and those, on the other hand, who feel that whatever happens, they are on their own. So as Graham Hess says, that second group are people who believe that things just happen by chance. And it may be good, it may be bad. It's hard to say. Shyamalan constructs the story in such a way that we can vicariously see Hess move from seeing the world as happenstance, as chance, to seeing the world as governed by providence. And this is as a result of several things that happen, both to him and to his family, especially his son, and then especially at the end of the film, spoiler if you haven't seen it, events fall into place in such a way that he understands a comment that his wife made right at the end of her life, which he initially said when he was one of those people in the second group, thinking that things are chance and happenstance. He actually tells his brother it was merely the neurons firing in her brain as she died, and what she said was completely meaningless. She was remembering scraps of conversations and experiences. But when Graham Hess sees the meaning of what she said at the end of her life, he sees it as a providential grace, a way that God has actually spoken into and directed his situation. Now, I would argue that a film that does something like this is actually doing something like evangelism. Now, that's a little bit strange for me to say. If you know anything about M. Night Shyamalan, he's Hindu. He's not a Christian. And yet, the film Signs is completely loaded with Christian imagery, and the way the way the conflict is framed is in terms of a Christian understanding of the problem of evil, and the resolution is put in terms of a Christian conception of providence. But still, that means that it's a kind of advocacy for a certain way of looking at the world. We have these two alternatives. We might say a chance, happenstance view and a providential view. And the film actually makes the case for a providential view. And I'm not going to try to judge the question. I mean, this is something we might have an interesting conversation about and perhaps disagree about. Some people would say that I was enchanted by the film. Others might say I found it completely unbelievable because of the way all of those events are orchestrated and arranged and then fall into place. If you know much about Shyamalan's filmmaking, especially his older films, that's actually a tendency in the way that he puts films together. Of course, good news advocated by a fictional narrative can be whatever, in the view of the author, counts as good. It might be a theistic outlook. It might be a hedonistic outlook. Interestingly enough, many contemporary films advocate for a naturalist outlook. To use Graham Hess's way of putting it in Signs, that we are alone. I'm going to talk a little bit about this in one of my breakout sessions, but I think perhaps the ancestor, at least of modern naturalist films, is Stanley Kubrick's 2001: A Space Odyssey. And for me, a particularly germane image from that film, if you know it, is when Hal snips the life support hose of Frank Poole, the astronaut who's outside working on something that supposedly is broken, but it isn't really broken. How the wayward computer just informed them that it was broken, and he snips it, and then the camera shows Poole tumbling off into deep space. Now, there's a lot that's beautiful in 2001: A Space Odyssey. I'm tempted to ask how many people have seen. I know it's an old film. Okay, lots of people have seen it. There's a lot of beautiful images of the spaceship slowly moving through space to strains of Strauss's Blue Danube, for example. But in that moment, I think we see the vision really that Kubrick has. Now, it turns out, this is a semi-spoiler, it turns out that the background events that are driving the narrative in 2001 is intervening aliens. So you might say, well, wait a minute, we're not really alone because they're aliens. But the critical thing that I think is important for this is that Kubrick is arguing that there may be other beings like us. They may be so advanced that they seem that they're not like us, but they're natural organisms just like we are. So even if there are others like us, we and they are alone in the cosmos. There is no supernatural reality to give us succor, to give us aid, to providentially organize the universe. And if you think of recent films, there really have been a lot of films that make arguments for a naturalist way of looking at the world. Ridley Scott's Exodus, Gods and Kings is a telling of the Exodus story in which he tries to naturalize the plagues. But I think one thing that's interesting about Ridley Scott's film is, despite himself, because he's a good storyteller, he realizes that he has to keep increasing the scope and power of the plagues. And so by the time we're done, I think we begin to think, this doesn't look like a series of natural events at all anymore. But other films like Interstellar, you often have things that seem supernatural turn out to have completely naturalistic explanations. Or a really depressing film, Lars von Trier's Melancholia, if you've seen that one. It's about the end of the world, and there is a religious character played by Kiefer Sutherland, but he is so despairing he kills himself, and that leaves the agnostics and atheists to console one another as the world comes to its end. Now, if you remember my title, How Films Can Argue and Even Evangelize, I suspect many of you are thinking, of course films can evangelize. There's an entire subgenre of evangelistic religious films, perhaps starting with Billy Graham films, which began in the 1950s, and including films like The Cross and the Switchblade, and up to, in our own time, the Kendrick films like Courageous and Facing the Giants and Mom's Night Out. There's no doubt that many of these films have effectively communicated the gospel to large numbers of people. However, I think it's important that they're primarily viewed by Christians or by people that are induced to view them by committed Christians. If you think of the old Billy Graham model, the idea is invite a friend to a crusade or invite a friend to watch For Pete's Sake or one of those other films. Further, this is a little harsh. I'm going to try to be gentle here. Further, on Tolkien's criterion of enchantment, I would argue that while films like these are often instrumentally valuable for presenting the gospel, they often do so in ways that are less than enchanting, to put it in Tolkien's terms here. And what I mean by that, of course, is this is an aesthetic claim about how well do the films succeed as pieces of fictional narrative that engage in a kind of argument. Okay. Well, are there good examples of evangelistic films that have that power to enchant? I would argue that if you haven't viewed any films by Terrence Malick, you might want to give them a chance. Malick is a filmmaker many Christians have missed, in part because his style, his cinematic style, is rather foreboding. He's an art filmmaker, an experimental filmmaker. It's interesting, however, that he's received quite a bit of critical acclaim with his films, and there's quite an A-list of Hollywood stars that are eager to work in his films, people that include actors such as Christian Bale, Brad Pitt, Jim Caviezel, Sean Penn, Jessica Chastain, Colin Farrell, Christopher Plummer, Rachel McAdams, and the list goes on. It's almost like Hollywood stars line up when they know that Terrence Malick is making a film, even though, if you know anything about Malick, one of the idiosyncratic features of his style is he often films hundreds of feet of film, and then entire performances by actors often get cut out in the final cut. An example of this is his war film from 1998, The Thin Red Line, in which Adrian Brody in the script had a major part, and when Adrian Brody was out doing publicity for the film, someone said, well, I've seen a cut and your part almost doesn't exist in the film anymore. So that's one of the things that Malick does, is a lot of his artistry is in the cutting room when he puts the film together. He's produced a set of films that until very recently were fairly widely spaced out. Badlands in 1973, starring Martin Sheen. Days of Heaven, 1978, starring Richard Gere. The Thin Red Line, which had an A-list assembly of stars, primarily Sean Penn, Jim Caviezel, Nick Nolte. George Clooney has a bit role, and as I mentioned, Adrian Brody was in it as they were filming it in the script, but his part got almost completely excised. The New World, Colin Farrell, Christopher Plummer, Christian Bale in 2005. The Tree of Life, Brad Pitt, Jessica Chastain in 2011, and To the Wonder with Ben Affleck and Olga Kurylenko and Rachel McAdams in 2012. It's fair enough if I'm arguing that you guys should take a look at this, the work of this filmmaker. I should warn you, especially as we proceed from his earlier films to his later films, his films have an increasingly complex structure with fragmented narrative. non-diegetic shots of nature, which means shots of nature that don't seem to have anything to do with the plot or the narration. So there's a scene in Days of Heaven, for example, which is set in the early 1900s in the Texas Panhandle. There's like a 12-second scene of undulating wheat. That's a long time for wheat to undulate. And it is true that the film is about a farm, so the wheat is related to what's going on in the narration, but the way the camera lingers on images of nature goes way beyond advancing points in the plot. And another thing that he uses is extensive voiceovers, often late in production of the film, after most of the filming has been completed. The reason I want to bring him to your attention, though, is especially his recent films since The Thin Red Line in 1998 increasingly highlight the theme of human relationship to nature and the revelation of divine glory in nature and also in human beings, even in nature as it is painful and induces suffering, and even in human beings that are broken and scarred. Indeed, frequently the voiceovers that I've mentioned are such an important part of his film style. Frequently those voiceovers are clearly prayers said by the characters. This is less so in his earlier films, like Days of Heaven, for example, much more so since The Thin Red Line, and including The New World, and especially The Tree of Life. I'm going to tell you a little bit about two particular films, The Thin Red Line and The Tree of Life. The Thin Red Line, a film from 1998, is a war film focusing on the Battle of Guadalcanal. It's actually a remake of a film that was made in the mid-1900s from a novel by Jim Jones, the same author who wrote From Here to Eternity, which was also made into a film. It focuses on the Battle of Guadalcanal in the Pacific Theater in World War II. The primary focus of the narrative is a difficult assault on a well-fortified hill defended by Japanese soldiers on the island. However, on a deeper level, the film uses the theme of war to open up questions about how humans view nature, how they relate to nature, and ultimately how they treat one another. Indeed, the film starts with a voiceover narrative of often when Malick uses voiceovers, you're not completely clear who the characters are saying the voiceovers. But at the beginning of The Thin Red Line, it begins with the characters saying, "What is this war in the heart of nature?" Now, of course, they're talking about a battle. They're on the island of Guadalcanal. But they're also talking about a war in the heart of nature in human beings, in our relationship to one another and to nature. Critically, there are paired sets of characters, in each pair of which one of the characters is hard, pragmatic, and what we might call relationally closed, while the other is in an ethical, aesthetic, and spiritual sense open to shimmering glory outside the self, both in nature and in other people. The film begins with this voiceover that I've mentioned, but it starts with the character played by Jim Caviezel, Private Witt, enjoying an idyll in an Eden of a Melanesian village, swimming and boating, because he's on AWOL, because he took off and away from his unit, and is enjoying the peace and beauty that is there in nature, despite the fact that this is a theater of war. A key example of this contrast is Witt and Sergeant Welsh, played by Sean Penn. And I've got a clip here, if this works, in which Witt and Welsh have crossed swords or come into conflict repeatedly during the course of the film. But Welsh, even though he's annoyed by things like Witt's going AWOL and doing all kinds of crazy things, he notices there's something about him that actually he himself hungers for.
Hey, Whit. Who you making trouble for today?
What do you mean?
Well, isn't that what you like to do? Turn left when they say go right. Why are you such a troublemaker, Whit?
You care about me, don't you, Sergeant? I always felt like you did. Why do you always make yourself out like a rock? One day I can come up and talk to you. By the next day, it's like we never even met. Lonely house now. You ever get lonely?
Only around people.
Only around people.
You still believing in the beautiful light, are you? How do you do that? You're a magician to me.
I still see a spark in you.
There are a lot of things interesting about this scene. I think one thing that's really interesting is Welsh keeps asking Whit questions, and if you notice, Whit parries the questions by asking Welsh questions. So Welsh says, "Why are you such a troublemaker?" And Whit turns that around by asking, "Why are you so closed? Why are you so hard? It seems like you care about me, but it seems like you're also trying to be a rock." And Welsh then, toward the end, Welsh asks, "Are you still believing in that beautiful light?" And this is that idea that Whit is someone who sees glory when he's out there paddling a canoe in that Melanesian village, so close to the theater of war. He sees beauty all around him. And Welsh recognizes this. Are you still seeing that beautiful light? And if you notice, what Whit does is, again, he parries and turns that around and says, "I still see a spark in you." And if you also notice, as he's wandering around, there's so much. I mean, Malick pulls together so much and has so much going on. If you notice, when Whit's wandering around the damaged house and he goes to the area where the roof is destroyed, blown off, as Whit walks, the rafters make a pattern of a cross for a moment, right at the end of when he's walking into that room and stepping out. Whit is not only open to the spark in Welsh, he's open to glory in natures and is generous to others. I mean, this is not the only scene where he does that. There's a wonderful scene where he is away from the camp for a short period, and he comes in, and as he walks through the camp, he just places his hand on shoulder after shoulder of his comrades. And this is something that Malick often does, is human touch as a way of communicating grace and caring about people. And even though, this is a spoiler, Whit dies in the film, he dies in a sacrifice for others. Even though he dies, his view, his outlook is affirmed by the film in the closing voiceover, in which a character says, "Oh, my soul, let me be in you now. Look out through my eyes. Look out at the things you made, all things shining." It's a prayer, and he's inviting God to look through his eyes so that he'll see glory and beauty in the world. If I go back to what I said earlier about the theoretical question about film argumentation, it's fairly clear to me that the thin red line suggests that if we engage the world attentively, we will find divine glory, even in the midst of the ugliness and suffering of war. Beautiful film. The Tree of Life is Malick's 2011 film, and it's a very strange film. How many people have seen Tree of Life? Okay, handful of people. So I am being a kind of evangelist here for Terrence Malick. On one level, it's the story of a family, the O'Briens, raising their children in 1950s Central Texas. Many of the scenes are filmed in or around Waco, as a matter of fact. The key event of the story is the unexpected death at age 19 of the middle son, who in the film is called R.L., and the effect that his death has on the family, both after the event and in their reflections of their past with him. One of the things that's very disorienting about this film is that Malick shifts time in ways that he doesn't give you any guidance. So the film starts with the family getting the news of R.L.'s death when he is age 18. We see a period later in their lives, and then there's this very strange creation sequence. And before you know it, there are dinosaurs. Wait, I thought we were talking about Central Texas in the 1950s. And then there's an entire section of the film that is the boys growing up, the three O'Brien boys. Jack, the oldest boy, who is played as an adult in some of the scenes by Sean Penn, and R.L., the middle boy, who dies at age 19, and then a younger brother named Steve. The epigram for the film makes clear that the question of suffering is going to be placed in a theological context. It's a quote from Job 38, 4, and 7. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth, when the morning stars sang together, and all the sons of God shouted for joy? Now, if you think about this, think about the Job context, right? God is answering Job's question, you owe me an answer to the suffering that I've experienced, because I know that I haven't sinned. I know I haven't done wrong, and that my friends who have sat here in the dust with me, who keep telling me that I'm paying the consequences now for sin in my past. Why is this happening? And notice what Malick chooses to focus on. God's answer is, where were you when I created the world? What do you know about creation? The story is also framed in terms of the dichotomy between nature and grace. There's an opening voiceover by Mrs. O'Brien, played by Jessica Chastain, in which she talks about having been taught as a child by nuns, presumably in a parochial school, that there are two ways of life, the way of nature and the way of grace. And if you think about it, it's not a stretch to think of fruits of the Spirit or the fruit of the Spirit and the fruit of the flesh as representing this dichotomy between nature and grace. Nature always seeks its own. Nature strives and vies, whereas grace is giving and forgives and seeks the best and so forth. So what about this scene of creation? Well, partly what it's doing in the film is applying the comment of God to Job to the situation of the O'Brien family. It's as though the characters reflect on what kind of God that created the universe, how would that God answer the question? In fact, Miss O'Brien, who early in the film seems to articulate a very simplistic faith. God will always take care of us, and God lives up in the sky, she tells her young son. And no one who lives according to the way of grace will come to a bad end. And yet we know that's not true. Look at I'm just going to give you a little clip of the creation narrative. dinosaurs. It's 50s Central Texas. The creation sequence undermines the grace-nature dichotomy that Mrs. O'Brien gives us at the beginning of the film on several levels. First, at some point, we often in Malick's films, we don't know what's going on, and you have to watch them multiple times to figure out what's going on. But in the case of this dinosaur sequence, we actually do know what's going on because one of Malick's effects people gave an interview. Malick almost never gives interviews, but an effects person gave an interview and said that what the script is getting at there is at some point in the history of the world, some conscious agent made a conscious choice to not assert superior strength and to take its advantage. And there's been an interesting discussion in the blogosphere. Wait, we're talking about chicken-brained raptors here. Could they really do something like that? But in a way, that question misses the point, because Malick is simply saying at some point in the history of the universe, we don't know when, but grace emerged in the way that organisms engage with one another. But even more important, further, gratuitous sublime beauty was a part of nature long before awareness or even human life appeared. Now, I know we could have a controversial discussion here. Malick is assuming an evolutionary view. If you look at the way the film is put together, if you watch the sequence of creation the whole way through. But what's important to me is it's clearly a theistic conception of nature. Nature is gratuitously beautiful. Nature is amazing, and further, it's providing an answer to the cry of suffering of the character Miss O'Brien. The answer to the cry of suffering isn't a theodicy that through a philosophical argument explains, well, here's why evil occurs, here's why suffering occurs. Instead, it's the answer given to Job. And that is, the God who made such a glory-filled world deserves our love and trust. The central scene of the film drives this point home in a sermon in a church service on the subject of Job and suffering. And I know I'm getting short on time, but this is worth at least watching part of. So one more, this is the last clip I'll show here. This is Mr. O'Brien playing the organ, and that's the young Jack.
On high, that the integrity of his behavior would protect him against misfortune. And his friends thought mistakenly that the Lord could only have punished him because secretly he'd done something wrong. But no, misfortune befalls the good as well. We can't protect ourselves against it. We can't protect our children. We can't say to ourselves, even if I'm not happy, I'm going to make sure they are. We run before the wind. We think that it will carry us forever. It will not. We vanish as a cloud. We wither as the autumn grass, and like a tree are rooted up. Is there some fraud in the scheme of the universe? Is there nothing which is deathless? Nothing which does not pass away? We cannot stay.
I'm going to quit there because if you notice something I find really fascinating, when R.L. is the young boy who looks up at the stained glass image of the captive Christ, the Ecce Homo, that image occurs at almost precisely the halfway point of the film. And Malick sometimes does kind of wave his arms, and I think that's one way he's waving his arms. If we want the answer to suffering, the answer comes in the imminent presence of God with us, the presence of the suffering one, such that the answer to Job-like questions is not, as I said, a philosophical argument, but an invitation to see that grace is made evident in the world, in the glory of creation amidst suffering, pain, and disorder. In the thirsty dryness of our human loves, we catch a glimpse of the lake that is fed from below by unfathomable hidden springs. And by the way, a significant part of the sermon that the pastor is preaching there is borrowed from one of Kierkegaard's edifying discourses in a very beautiful way. So as I said, the film begins with a dichotomization of nature and grace, with Mrs. O'Brien's narration suggesting that grace is good and nature hard and cruel. On one level, the characters are developed in such a way that Mr. O'Brien clearly represents nature, Mrs. O'Brien clearly represents grace. And we might think that, well, clearly, based on what she said and what we know, grace is good, nature is bad. But what the film is trying to do is say, no, nature is good as God creates it, and so the objective of human life is a synthesis of nature and grace, that we find, almost I think of Romans chapter 1, that we find the grace of God revealed in the things that he has made, and we see, yes, nature is capable of harshness. You saw in that image of the creation sequence, the bloody wounded dinosaur on the beach, the hammerhead shark circling, right? So Malick wants to say, if we present nature in all of its fullness, of course we do see harshness and cruelty, but if we have eyes to see, we are also going to see God's grace. God's grace is revealed in it. If I had time, I would tell you a little bit about To the Wonder. I don't. That's a film in which the key idea, if nature is the focus in The Thin Red Line and in The Tree of Life, human relationships and human love are the focus in To the Wonder. And To the Wonder is a story of broken and failed loves, and the fact that our broken and failed loves point us to the love that loves us, the love that is undying and perfect, and that is God's love. So where is this supposed to go? As I said, this is something completely different. I want to argue that there is an apologetic application to the things I've had to say here. Films are the modern currency of culture. Just as Paul was conversant with pagan Greek culture, we should be conversant with the content of contemporary culture. And indeed, what I want to argue is that a book that I suspect not many of you have read, by C.S. Lewis, of all people. C.S. Lewis has a little book called An Experiment in Criticism. I would argue that Lewis argues that we should learn to be good readers. He's talking here about written texts. And that means we need to be receptive to a work of art and let it speak to us. I would argue that Lewis's ideas about a text can be applied to the text of film. And we should be, as I said, like Paul. Paul had received artifacts of pagan culture. He didn't merely look them up in the library and say, when someone offers me an argument, I can quote Simonides or some other pagan poet. But he had thought about, what does this mean? How does it relate to the truth of the gospel? We need to be prepared to use that content apologetically, both when it supports or points to the gospel in cases like these films of Terrence Malick that I've discussed, and also when it's opposed to the gospel. We need to be clear about that in films like Interstellar or Crimes and Misdemeanors by Woody Allen or other films like that. So, do we have time for questions here? Okay. Shoot.
Thanks very much, first
Sure.
of all. Two-part question that you could answer both opinionated or experiential and research-based.
Okay.
First part, when it comes to your linear, with the documentaries being over here and narrative fiction over here, I guess, have you come across which one carries any more weight in being effective and efficient in evangelizing and sharing the gospel?
Well, remember what I tried to do was undermine that dichotomy. That's a standard way, and in fact, when scholars first started thinking about whether films make arguments, they tended to say, no, argumentation is a very specific way of using language. Premise, conclusion. Films don't do that. They have narrative sequences. And what I wanted to do then is undermine that by saying, if we're thinking in interpretive framework or worldview terms, what we see is that I think in many cases we're going to be able to say a film like the Tree of Life, I think what it's arguing is that God's grace is evident in nature, and we need to learn to embrace even the complexity and suffering that's part of living in a broken human world. So there's an argument there as well.
Sure. Okay, and then the second part kind of leads into that. When it comes to the documentary side, have you had any experience with almost like a Malick-like approach, or like a cinema verite type of approach, where there's the filmmakers remove themselves into documentary filmmaking, which holds a lot of ground, I feel, because it's not just it's not any sort of fiction or anything. It's actual life, even though a film camera is there. Have you had any experience with evangelistic types of documentary filmmaking like that, going in and sharing a message, very artistically inclined, but showing a certain kind of flow or message through that?
I'm not aware of artistically made. I mean, I know there are certainly training films for evangelism and so forth, but as for something that's more like that would have that power that Tolkien talks about, of enchanting us and engaging us and drawing us in, I'm not aware of that. I do know Malick is planning to expand the creation nature section is an 18-minute part of the Tree of Life. He's producing an IMAX feature-length history of the cosmos that's supposed to be released. It was supposed to be released a couple of years ago, and the release date keeps getting delayed. So something like that is going to come out, and I'm actually looking forward to it. I think it's going to be amazing.
Cool. All right, thank you very much.
Just a quick question. As far as films being used to evangelize, as faith films have become a staple, as they've really started out at the Kendricks and really moved forward,
right.
Most faith films are hit critically bad. So as in just plain bad, because they either, like the Kendrick films, preach to the choir,
right,
or they do a really bad job of sloppily putting a bunch of bad actors together. So should our...
Well, I said I didn't want to be mean. Let me say one thing. I'm not a huge fan of comedies, but I think Mom's Night Out was a significant improvement.
Absolutely.
Precisely because they did. It didn't feel like they sat down at a table before they wrote the script and said, "How do we get the gospel message in here?" Right? And notice, I'm trying to speak really carefully here. Of course, I don't think it's a bad thing to get the gospel message in. That's not the problem. But if it seems like what you've done is you've constructed a fictional vehicle to simply transport the gospel, then in a way it makes the communication of the gospel much less effective.
That was my question, is should faith films be more focused on getting people to ask questions so that they seek them out? I would say more of the Medea characters. In all of his movies, he does some pretty out there stuff, but it's because it gains people to ask questions about why they tie to faith, and it brings them back. Should that be more of the focus for faith films to go?
Well, I read, view, analyze films. I'm not sure I should be instructing people on how to write screenplays, but I'm with you in thinking that films that raise questions in that way are often much more engaging. And I'll give an example of one I criticized here. I think Christians should watch Ridley Scott's Exodus, Gods and Kings. Not because I know Christians were annoyed by several things. For those of you who didn't see it, there's not only do the plagues get naturalized, but God is presented as like a 10-year-old boy. When he communicates with God, it's an avatar. Clearly, Ridley Scott knows that God isn't a 10-year-old boy, right? But he has to somehow relate to him. And I think what I didn't like it at first. I have to say, the first time I saw the film, it annoyed me. And I thought, Ridley Scott is just trivializing God. And I realized, wait a minute. He's thinking about this very problem of, in a way, inheriting assumptions about a genre. And he thought, you can only hire Morgan Freeman to be God so many times, right? So let's try to do something different, and maybe it'll work, maybe it won't work.
Well, thank you, Dr. Calhoun. We'll expect you back next year to talk about using Medea movies for evangelism. But that was excellent. And Dr. Calhoun will be doing several sessions this afternoon, so please stop by. Before we depart for lunch, let me bless our meal. Father, thank you so much for the talks that we've had this morning. Thank you for nature and grace and art and beauty and all of these things that inhabit our world. I pray that you would bless our meal and bless our time of fellowship that follows. In Jesus' name, amen.